This is the story of two religious journeys. Both our pilgrims are British Muslims, and both have been powerfully influenced by the form of Islam we've come to know as Wahabism. One of them grew up soaked in its traditions.
Both my parents are from families of very devout religious scholars, and specifically Wahhabi scholars, with strong links to Saudi Arabia. I was heavily involved with the spread in this country. It's a very big phenomenon now with dozens and dozens of groups and mosques.
For the other, it came as a revelation.
My parents, they said, this is a new religion that you're bringing. I said, no, actually quite the opposite. What you're following is the new religion. This is the old religion, what the Prophet Muhammad himself said.
The creed, which has played such a big part in their lives, has a very bad press.
I think that term Wahhabi has come in the popular imagination to be associated with anything that's literalist, violent, extremist. We hear about Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia, we hear about Wahhabis in Chechnya, we hear about Wahhabis in Bosnia, we hear about Wahhabis all over the place.
It's the form of Islam that dominates Saudi Arabia, and Osama bin Laden is one of those associated with the movement. But does Wahhabism really deserve its reputation for violence and extremism, or indeed its association with misogyny and sectarianism? And how on earth did a movement which began in the depths of the Arabian desert some 3 centuries ago come to spread its influence across the modern world? In this programme, I'm going to explore those questions with the help of expert witnesses and the testimony of our 2 believers.
Music was frowned upon in our household. We didn't listen to music growing up in this country because it's the work of the devil, basically, and good, devout people shouldn't waste their time with music or singing or dancing or entertainment.
Sheikh Dr. Usama Hassan is, as his titles suggest, both a Muslim cleric and a scientist. He's from a scholarly family in the Salafi tradition with which Wahhabism is closely associated. Salafi is a broader term taken from a word used to describe the original followers of the Prophet Muhammad, and Salafis see true Islam in the austere practices of those early days.
I like that kind of monastic lifestyle, if you like. There's a real joy to it. If you're a believer and you're devout, it keeps your life focused. And I was brought up like that. Obviously, the 5 daily prayers, fasting every year, studying the Quran daily, memorizing the Quran in its entirety. I'd done that by the age of 11. It's a very different upbringing, if you like, to a secular society like Britain. And it's very different to many Muslim families also who may not be so devout or scholarly.
The Sufi tradition, with its mysticism and attachment to saints, is very different. Abu Khadija was brought up in a Sufi family from Pakistani Kashmir and came to Salafism and Wahhabi ideas by, to use his own word, conversion.
We'd been raised to just follow the local imam in the mosque. So whatever they basically said, we did. My invitation to Salafism came through my brother. He was Salafi before I was. He was studying at university. Within 1 year he came back and he said, we need to return back to the fundamentals. I said, what do you mean fundamentals? We're Muslims. We're all upon the fundamentals. He said, no, we're not upon the fundamentals. So you need to learn the truth about your religion. So my conversion came from that direction.
Essentially you used the word conversion.
Yeah.
Was that big a change, was it?
Yes, it was a mighty change because it is a huge shift. It is a huge shift from one side to the other.
Those we call Wahhabis don't like the term. They say it's used by their enemies and prefer to be called Salafi or simply Muslim. But the name derives from Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab, who was born in the early years of the 18th century in Najd, the vast central desert of the Arabian Peninsula. It's been said that Najd enjoyed one advantage over the rest of the region. It was so remote that no one was interested in conquering it. But Ibn Abd al-Wahhab was a highly educated man and studied at the holy city of Medina, where he would have come into contact with some of the reform movements which were developing all over the Muslim world then. He took on the so-called schools of Islam, which had built up their own bodies of Islamic law and teaching, and he challenged the established way of interpreting Islamic texts, including what are known as hadiths, reports of what the Prophet Muhammad did and said. That may sound on the dry as dusty side, but it was revolutionary, because it meant questioning the traditional idea that the truth was passed on from one generation of scholars to the next, the so-called chain of transmission. Natana Dilongba is a professor of theology at Boston College in Massachusetts, and the author of a book called Wahhabi Islam.
Ibn Abd al-Wahhab, he said, looking at chains of transmission is nice, but anybody could make up the chains of transmission. What's really important is the content of what the hadith actually says. And if it is in keeping with the teachings of the Quran, then we can assume that it is authentic. But if it somehow is in contradiction to what the Quran teaches, then it can't possibly be right. The Quran must have absolute authority as the divine word of God. And he was concerned that people of his time not only were giving too much attention to hadith transmitted by certain individuals, but also to certain interpreters. So-and-so said this back in the 12th century, and as though that's the last word on it ever. Only God has the final word. He recognized the need for constant reinterpretation of the tradition because our contexts are constantly changing.
So it was fundamentalist in the correct sense of the word, in the sense that it meant go back to the original texts and try and work out what they mean, but also quite liberal in the sense that he believed in the idea of reinterpreting things for your own age.
Yes, and that was a concept that had been moved away from for a number of centuries. He was very clear about the need to engage in independent reasoning, not just as formal religious scholars, but this was something that he also talked about the need for ordinary people to do, that they needed to use their own critical thinking and evaluation to see whether or not something that a sheikh was saying actually made sense.
I know it's incredibly dangerous to make comparisons with movements in other religions, but the way you describe it does bring to mind the Protestant Reformation. Do you think there's anything in that comparison that's illuminating?
If we're looking very loosely at the parallel of returning to the direct revelation of God and making that revelation immediately accessible to all people rather than just a select group of religious scholars, then I think that parallel can be drawn. I'm not sure I'd really want to take it too far beyond that.
There are many things we don't know about Ibn Abd al-Wahhab. We have, for example, no idea what he looked like. But there are a handful of famous stories which illustrate what he believed and what sort of a man he was. He is famously reported to have cut down a sacred tree. People had begun to hang offerings on branches in the belief that they could secure some kind of blessing by doing so. To Ibn Abd al-Wahhab, it was an example of the kind of idolatrous practice that had seeped into Islam and polluted its purity, and he took his axe to the trunk to make a public point. Usama Hassan.
12 centuries after the Prophet, when Ibn Abd al-Wahhab came along, Islam now had a very rich tradition of legal and mystical and theological schools, and absorbed all kinds of influences and thought, including Jewish, Christian, Hellenic, Indian, African, you name it, all kinds of influences. And a lot of Ibn Abd al-Wahhab's movement was about saying, let's get back to the basics and strip down all this complicated Islam, which of course he also felt had fallen into polytheism and idolatry. Rituals and customs and culture had become so much part of Islam, and he felt that much of the theology or mysticism was going away from a very strict, uncompromising monotheism, the original spirit of the Islam of the Prophet himself.
At the heart of everything he did was the ideal of what's known in Arabic as Tawheed, the strict monotheism which he believed was Islam's central truth. And his writings on Tawheed are often cited by his followers today as the main reason his teachings have endured for so long. But at the time, his method of ramming the message home often got him into trouble. Abu Khadija.
Not far from him was a village called Huraymala. There was a grave, a shrine they had made to a brother of the second caliph of Islam. They turned it into a shrine and they would sacrifice there at that grave. Many years later, when he returned back after his studies, he demolished the grave. So that sent ripples across the whole of Arabia. Here's a man who's turned up after 1,000 years that we've been building shrines and tombs over the graves of the righteous that we've been sacrificing to, and he's knocking down the shrines. So that straight away put him in conflict.
Ibn Abd al-Wahhab was kicked out of several towns and villages. The religious authorities of the day saw him as a threat. There was even a failed assassination attempt against him after he denounced sex outside marriage. He was a fundamentalist, but that's not at all the same as being a conservative. Indeed, he was much more of a revolutionary. Today, for example, his teaching is often associated with repressive restrictions on the way women are allowed to live. But Natana Dilongba says what he actually wrote simply doesn't support that link. Because he argued that every believer should study the Quran, he thought that women had as much right to education as men, and
I think at many levels he was someone who supported more of a balance of rights for women, especially where family law was concerned. And so he insisted that women had to have a voice in their marriage. Her consent was absolutely required in order for the marriage to be valid. Just as the husband had access to divorce, he said that the wife had to have equal access to divorce. He talked about the importance of prohibiting rape, and that was seen as a very serious crime that needed to be punished and handled very seriously.
There is, however, another famous story about Ibn Abd al-Wahhab which casts a rather different light on his view of women's rights. He was approached by a woman who confessed adultery, and after repeated attempts to persuade her to change her ways, agreed, reluctantly we are told, that she should be stoned to death. Madawi al-Rashid is a professor at the Middle East Centre of the London School of Economics.
Certainly, Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab is not a feminist. He was simply trying to provide interpretations and allow the situation of women to be governed by Sharia. To just give you an example, Sharia says that women should inherit half the share of men. And this is a common Islamic principle. So Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab could not change that simply because there is a text in the Quran which says that women inherit half the share of men. And therefore, for some scholars to say that Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab was a feminist, I think is far-fetched.
Ibn Abd al-Wahhab is also often cast as the father of today's violent jihadi movements. And here too, Natana Dilongba argues that he doesn't deserve the bad press.
For the most part, what he talked about were limitations on the fighting. That if you are engaged in a jihad as a military self-defense of the Muslim community, you are only allowed to commit as much violence as is absolutely necessary. You are only fighting up until the point where you are able to end the conflict. He also called for limitations on killing. He said it's very important to remember that you cannot kill civilians. You may not kill women, you may not kill children, you may not kill elderly people, you may not kill men of religion. And he specifically mentioned rabbis and priests.
Did he believe that you should wage jihad to convert people?
No, his method of conversion really was focused more on the idea of inviting people to be educated.
But Ibn Abd al-Wahhab was a pragmatist as well as a preacher. To protect himself, he did a deal with a desert leader called Muhammad ibn Saud. And yes, that's Saud as in the House of Saud, who rules Saudi Arabia today. After his conversion, Abu Khadija devoted himself to the study of Salafi Islam, and he's a frequent visitor to Saudi Arabia.
This incident that occurred between Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab and Muhammad bin Saud was fate, pre-decreed by God. This is what we believe. So he actually committed himself to the cause, and Muhammad bin Saud says, I will stick to your teachings, but will you give me the pledge of allegiance as the ruler of this place? He said, I will obey you. So they made a pact upon that. He said, in that case, Ibn Abdul Wahhab, I will carry your message to the townships. So he spread the message. You know, the rest is history.
Towards the end of his life, Ibn Abd al-Wahhab withdrew from public life. He died around 1792, and those who studied his teachings argue that his followers very soon began to incorporate other, more violent ideas into their thinking. Professor Natana Dilongba.
By this point, we're really dealing with the second generation of the Wahhabis. Ibn Abdul Wahhab was dead, and so his sons and grandsons were taking over as leaders. By that point, the original founder of the political movement, Muhammad ibn Saud, was also dead. His son had taken over. His son was much more interested in state expansion, in the accumulation of wealth, in conquering as much territory as he possibly could. And I think we see that in a most pronounced way in 1802, when Najaf and Karbala in what is today Iraq were completely sacked by the Wahhabis, and the Shia shrines were destroyed. This was, in some respects, showed the degree to which this could become very, very extreme.
The destruction of Shia Islam's holiest shrines by the Sauds and their Wahhabi soldiers has polluted the relationship between Wahhabis and the Shia ever since. Indeed, it informs a widespread perception among other Muslims of all kinds that Wahhabis are violently sectarian. Sheikh Ruzwan Muhammad is a Sunni theologian.
For Shia Islam, the desecration of the shrine in Karbala was a watershed because of the fact that Hussein is the grandson of the Prophet and he comes out to fight the Umayyad Caliph. For Shiism, that's a fight between good and evil. And Hussein represents the hero, and he represents the epitome of good and godliness. And in that process, he's martyred and buried in Karbala. And so when this movement went to desecrate his resting place, in a sense what it did, it aligned itself in their psyche with the Umayyad Caliph, and by default with evil. And that remains within the meta-history of Shia Islam, a very potent description of Wahhabism.
Another current of violent ideas flowed into the broad Wahhabi movement in the 20th century. The revolutionary creed of political Islam, Islamism as we now call it, first flourished in Egypt, but many of its followers found their way to Saudi Arabia, bringing their violent ideas with them. Abu Khadija, who rejects violent interpretations of Islam, says the Islamists corrupted Ibn Abdul Wahhab's teaching even further.
The teachings of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab run contrary to what many of these insurgent movements are upon, whether it be Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden. What's happened is that these violent revolutionary ideas, they infiltrated themselves into the Gulf, because initially they were North African in origin, Egypt, and this is now dating back to the late 1960s. The Egyptian government began to imprison the Islamic Brotherhood. When they were slowly being released, Saudi Arabia and many of the Gulf countries, they took them on board on the basis of, we give sanctuary to people who are oppressed, so we'll give him sanctuary. And those teachings of Sayyid Qutb, the greatest scholar of the Muslim Brotherhood, began to now infiltrate into the academic circles in Saudi Arabia.
This process of DIY Islam has meant that they have let the genie out of the bottle, and people can just express themselves in whichever way they want.
The Sunni theologian Sheikh Ruzwan Muhammad says that Wahhabi teaching is especially vulnerable to corruption precisely because of that revolutionary idea that everyone should study Islam's texts and evaluate them for themselves.
You have Facebook, you have YouTube, and for the general population, Muslim population, who are not educated in the sources, who have not had basic Islamic education, anybody with a semblance of religious appearance, for them is a religious leader. And how are you able to differentiate between one and another? One calls to the Quran and the prophetic norm, and the other person does exactly the same. Now, how do you establish authority? The authority here has become democratized. So if your Muslim population has become used to democratizing knowledge, then everybody in the sense of the ideas in the world and the worldview, everybody's idea is exactly the same. And the most tempting is the one that provides the quickest solution. And sometimes, in many situations, that usually indicates the most violent.
Whatever the cause and whatever terminology you choose to use, there can be no doubt that many modern jihadi movements claim a close link with Wahhabism. In his second year of study at Cambridge, the young Salafi scholar Usama Hassan went to fight the Soviets in Afghanistan. He says he was driven by a desire to join the general Muslim resistance against godless communists, rather than specifically Wahhabi ideas, but
we did choose very carefully which group we went to fight with in Afghanistan, because there were so many groups fighting there. And the most famous one I think we'd heard the most about was Hekmatyar, the Islamist group. But we went with a smaller Salafi group, specifically Salafi group. So we did take a very sectarian, because their theology and practice fitted most closely with ours, so we were most comfortable out there in very difficult situations in the training camp and at the front.
Cambridge physics undergraduates don't generally head off to fight religious wars in foreign lands, and Usama Hassan's jihad raises one of those questions I posed at the beginning of this programme. Why do the teachings of an 18th century desert preacher have such a widespread influence across today's world? The key lies in that pact between Ibn Abdul Wahhab and the House of Saud, but we, the British, played a part too. After the First World War and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, we supported the House of Saud's campaign to establish a new kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which gave them custody of Islam's two holiest places, Mecca and Medina. With the Saudi oil boom of the 1970s, the final piece of the jigsaw fell into place.
Oil is the foundation for all Saudi plans. With a quarter of the world's known oil, Saudi Arabia exports more than any other country, and most of it comes through here, 1 million tons a day.
You can call this chance or providence according to your taste, but Wahhabi ideas flowed around the world on a tide of black gold. Abu Khadija.
When oil was tapped and it started gushing out of the ground in Saudi Arabia, they prostrated to God, because they actually saw it as a gift and a blessing and a bounty from God Almighty. And they saw it also as a means now that we are going to spread the message of monotheism to every corner of the earth. All four corners of the earth are going to hear this message.
Many Muslim majority countries with a lot of oil wealth, surplus wealth, have tried to use that wealth to increase their influence abroad.
Usama Hassan.
For a mixture of bona fide religious reasons, that they want to do goodness for humanity, plus also political reasons. Now the Saudis, with their huge oil wealth, have been the most effective at that, in promoting their strand of Islam, Wahhabi Islam, around all countries of the world for the last 50 or 60 years. But the Iranians have done that also since the 79 revolution. In fact, Iran and Saudi Arabia have fought a proxy war for the last 30-odd years, everywhere. Includes Pakistan, a lot of the problems we see there, Afghanistan, Bahrain certainly, Syria, we see that playing out now, and certainly in Muslim communities in Western countries.
In 2001, not long after the terrorist attacks of 9/11, Usama Hassan was invited to a meeting in Mecca by an old friend from university. His contact turned out to be an Al-Qaeda supporter, and he asked Usama Hassan to join the group as a propagandist. He agreed. But when he began to work on the text he'd been asked to translate, a fatwa justifying the killing of civilians, it brought him up short. His religious journey took an unexpected direction.
I've been blessed to be able to meet a wide range of religious teachers, and of course I'm also a trained scientist. I studied theoretical physics and engineering at Cambridge and London, etc. And I have a strong rationalist element to my thinking, and so I would constantly compare religious teaching with the wider experience. And it gradually became very clear to me that Wahhabism or Salafism is very well intentioned in terms of being Puritan and trying to recapture the original spirit of Islam, but is actually a very narrow and a fairly superficial reading of the scriptures and of the Islamic tradition. And I think we see some of the problems associated with that in the world. A lot of Salafis and Wahhabis, unfortunately, are very narrow-minded, if you like, very intolerant. They will often enforce their doctrines vehemently and harshly on other people, including using threats of violence or actual violence, as we see with Al-Qaeda.
Usama Hassan, Salafi scholar and jihadi as he once was, has left Wahhabism behind and today works for the anti-extremism organisation, the Quilliam Foundation. But Abu Khadija, the convert to Salafism, maintains that there's no link between modern jihadism and the teachings of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, and he remains committed to those teachings and their expression in today's Saudi Arabia.
All of the teachings of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, including his view upon women, refer back to the Quran and the prophetic tradition of the Messenger Muhammad, peace be upon him.
And if you look at the position of women in Saudi Arabia today, not able to drive, unable to leave their homes without a male, do you think that the position of women in Saudi Arabia today accurately reflects the sort of values that he tried to put forward in regards of women?
The examples that you brought are actually not the best examples. A woman can leave her house in Saudi Arabia, by the way, without a mahram, what they call a male. She can. What she can't do is travel from city to city.
Okay.
This is not an injunction of Saudi Arabia. This is a prophetic injunction, because the Prophet Muhammad said, does the woman have to veil? Yes, she has to veil herself. He believed in that because that's a Quranic injunction. Driving is not forbidden for a Muslim female to drive. My wife does drive. There's no such injunction in the Quran. But is there an injunction in Saudi Arabia for women not to drive? Yes, there is, because it is a law of the land. Is it outdated? That's not for me to judge. That's for the judges in Saudi Arabia and the lawmakers in Saudi Arabia. But it is not a Quranic injunction.
Saudi Arabia is unique. That desert deal between Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab and Muhammad ibn Saud 2.5 centuries ago still defines its character. Elsewhere in the Middle East, Wahhabi teaching flourishes without the support of state piety. It is, for example, widely accepted in the Gulf state of Qatar, but there the law allows women to drive. One of the most contentious issues in today's Saudi Arabia is the treatment of the country's Shia Muslim minority. There have been numerous Shia protests like this one in Mecca a couple of years ago. Shia make up between 10 and 15% of the population, and most of them are concentrated in the east of the country. Many of their leaders argue that the Saudi state restricts their freedom and denies them a full share of the economic benefits flowing from the region's oil. And like everything else in Saudi Arabia, that political argument has a religious dimension. Because Wahhabis, and the implications of this are very serious, don't accept that some Shia are Muslim at all. Abu Khadija.
The Shia are many sects. The most extreme of the Shia are not Muslim. It's not that they've been taken outside of Islam. They're not regarded to be Muslim from the beginning, from the get-go.
You can see why people think that Wahhabism encourages sectarianism in the light of what you've just said.
Yes. As Muslims and as Salafis, we believe that sectarianism is an inevitability. Does it mean that we love it? It doesn't mean that we love it or enjoy sectarianism. The Prophet Muhammad himself said that my nation will divide into 73 sects. All of them will end up into the hellfire except for one. It is that which I and my disciples are upon today. This is what Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab was calling to. Give up your own ideologies. Give up these doctrines that you've invented yourselves and that your teachers have invented. And let us refer back to that core fundamental message. No true Muslims who truly believe in the Quran and the Sunnah are going to oppose the words of God and His Messenger.
In other words, and I hope this is not too much of a caricature of the Wahhabi position, the arguments will be over when everyone agrees with us. Professor Madawi al-Rashid of the London School of Economics.
Islam spread throughout the world as a result of flexibility rather than rigidity. So there are multiple ways of being Muslim. But the Wahhabis are trying to detach Islam from its culture and reject all those Muslims who want to cling to their cultural tradition yet remain Muslim. And the conflict starts when Wahhabism wants to eradicate difference.
At the beginning of this programme, we heard that Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab was both a fundamentalist and a reformer. I'll leave the final judgments to our two believers. Abu Khadija, the former Sufi turned Salafi, values his teaching because it takes Islam back to its basic truth.
When people look at Salafism, they say these people are unchangeable. They don't alter. They don't want to adapt, and there's no evolution within their movement. But if one looks at it from a different perspective, which is, actually, it's not us. The Quran hasn't changed in 1400 years. The prophetic tradition that was there 1400 years ago is the same prophetic tradition. So really, what needs changing?
For our other pilgrim, Usama Hassan, it's the reformer, not the fundamentalist, who really matters.
Ironically, Ibn Abdul Wahhab, he saw himself as a reformer, complaining about a lot of corruption of Islam in his time. And the irony often happens is followers of the reformers become bogged down in just following that cult, or that sect, if you like, and they lose that spirit of reform. And what Islam and every religion needs is regular renewal and reform to make it relevant to the daily lives of millions of people in a very different, modern, globalized world, which is, a million miles away, really, almost millions of years away from Ibn Abdul Wahhab himself.